Hi, I'm Reverend Cindy Layton, and I'm the pastor at Smithville First United Methodist Church. Welcome to worship today. As part of this video, you will hear the choir's special song for the morning, and you will hear me as I give the sermon. I hope that it blesses your heart. God bless. The story of Moses out of a regular adult kind of Bible, and here it is out of this children's Bible. Moses and the deep water. The great river of Egypt was deep. Among the rushes was a floating basket. A princess of Egypt came to bathe. She looked inside the floating basket. Poor little Hebrew baby. The king of Egypt wants to harm the Hebrew babies. A mother is trying to save her son. Well, I shall keep him safe now, and I shall give him a name, Moses. But I need someone to take care of him. A little girl stepped out from the rushes. The princess guessed who? Baby Moses' sister. I know someone, said the girl. The princess was delighted. The little girl brought her mother. She was, of course, the baby's mother, too. So Moses was safe from the water. When Moses grew up, he found out about the wicked king. He found out that the Hebrew people were the king's slaves. He found out that they were treated very badly. When he tried to help, he got into trouble. He had to run away from Egypt. In the wild country, he saw a strange thing. A bush was on fire, but it wasn't burning up. As he looked, he heard a voice. It was God. God told Moses to go to the king of Egypt. Tell him to let the Hebrew people go free, said God. Moses went and asked. The king was angry. But God wanted the Hebrews to go free. Nothing went right for the king or for Egypt till at last he changed his mind. Moses led his people out of Egypt. They reached a sea. God spoke to Moses, lift up your stick. When Moses lifted his stick, the waters moved aside. They left a path through the sea. Moses and the Hebrews were safe from the water. God had set them free. Oftentimes, that's about where we go with the story of Moses. We whip right through it. We get to the Red Sea. We think that's the coolest part, and we forget about all that happened for that to be a reality. Moses was born into a very dangerous time, wasn't he? And there were two midwives who decided that they would go against the Pharaoh's edict to kill all the baby boys when they were born. And Shua and Pua, I think were their names. They have interesting names for these days. They just would lie. When the Pharaoh would say, so where are these baby boys that you're supposed to be killing? They would say, we got there and those Hebrew women are fast. And those babies are already being born by the time we get there, and they're hiding them, and we don't know where they are. Well, the Lord even used that deceit on their behalf to increase the Hebrew people, and Moses' mother and father had to take that huge risk. Amram and Jochebed were his parents, and they're not mentioned in the story, but later in genealogies and lineage lines they're mentioned. They were so courageous, and God used Jochebed's courage. That courageous act of making that little basket. She had lived in Egypt for a long, long time. She had seen those little reed boats floating up and down the river forever. And she knew that if she made one of those little baskets, she could cover it up with pitch, with tar on the outside, put her baby in it, and he would float. And instead of the king getting a hold of that baby, because by the time he was 3 months old, they just couldn't hide him anymore, she did that. And in faith, she probably kissed that baby goodbye, put him in that basket, and sent him down the Nile, and knew that the Lord would protect her son. Her faith was very strong, and her courageous act was what God used to place her son, that little boy, the Hebrew of God's choice, in Pharaoh's house because of that courageous mother. So our first lesson from this very powerful story is when we are faced with evil, when we are faced with something that we know is evil, and the Pharaoh's edict to kill all those baby boys was evil. There's no two ways about that. When we're faced with something that we know is evil, let's look for ways to act against it. And then place our trust in God to use our efforts for good. That's exactly what those midwives did, and that's exactly what Moses' mother and father did. They acted against evil, and something good came of it. Moses grew up knowing that he was an Egyptian. All he had to do was look at his, stepbrothers, and he would know that he was different. He didn't look Egyptian. He probably was much hairier than his brothers. The Hebrew people had a tendency to have much more facial hair and body hair than the Egyptians did. And so he just had to look around him to know which group of people he was probably more related to. And he knew that he was not Egyptian. And that story of his defense of his Hebrew relative, brother from the Hebrew clan, forced him to flee from Egypt. Now, when we just get down and dirty with it, he killed an Egyptian person and buried them in the sand. I mean, this was not normal behavior for a prince of Egypt. And when his fellow Hebrew person said, "So what are you going to do to me? You're going to kill me too?" He knew that he was in big trouble. And if the Israelites knew about it, the Egyptians knew about it too. And so Moses had to flee. Our second lesson is that God can use us no matter what we've done, no matter our history. And I don't know about you, but for me, that's really good news. No matter what we did in middle school, no matter what we did in high school, no matter bad choices we made in college, no matter, God can use us if we are repentant and willing. That's the whole thing about Jesus, right? That if we are repentant and willing, God can use us to do good things. And our past does not have to determine our future. I mean, Moses could have just gone, "I'm a murderer, end of story. I have no future." But he did not. And God used him for good. Between the time Moses leaves Egypt and the time God speaks to him from the burning bush, Moses' life has become very different. He went from being a prince of Egypt to being a wanted man on the run, and then ended up with his brother-in-law, and he ended up married, and he ended up with kids, but he ended up working as a shepherd out there in the middle of nowhere in Midian, and he did that for many, many years. Very different from living in a palace. A very kind of day in, day out, doing the same thing, watching the sheep, making sure they had food and were safe from predators all the time for years and years and years. Well, living as a nomadic shepherd, I'm sure unbeknownst to Moses at that point in his life, was preparing him to lead his people out of Egypt. Because if you've read the story, you know that he ended up shepherding 1 million or so folks for 40 years. Well, he knew all about shepherding. He knew all about having to get animals or people to move in the same direction. He knew all about those things. So, our next lesson is that God can use even the most normal, or what we may consider mundane, season of our lives. to prepare us for what lies ahead. To prepare us for what lies ahead. You know, there were times in my life teaching school where I thought, oh my word, you know. Especially, well, no, every teacher, if you have a specialty area, you teach the same, you know, kind of the same stuff, right? Every year, over and over, it's just different children. And sometimes, if you're not extremely creative, that can get a little bit, you know, I've done this now for 15 years, you know, or I've done this now for 30-some years, you know? And you could feel like that was kind of mundane. But you know, the Lord used all my interaction with people, with parents, with all of that. Oh, mercy. You don't know how much that has helped as a pastor in a church, right? You're dealing with people every day. And all of those years of doing something else prepared me in so many ways for pastoral ministry. Who would have known? So the Lord can use those very normal times when you think, Lord, I am so tired of doing the same thing over and over again, to prepare us. Now, when God speaks to Moses out of that burning bush, and you know, I've read that passage 1,000 times, I think, and this just now, when Bill was reading, I thought, oh, the angel called him first. I don't know that I had ever paid attention to that. We always go straight to God talking to Moses, but it said an angel called him. And then God spoke to him once his attention was on the bush. But when God speaks to Moses out of that burning bush, that was a life-changing moment for Moses. Right there, in the middle of that desert, in front of that bush. So our fourth lesson from this is that Moses' salvation experience, I think, was right there. When Moses changed, was right there. Not when he was running, not when he was sheep herding, it was right there. When God spoke to him, when Moses committed himself to being God's servant. That was when Moses' personal relationship with God began, right then in that place. And so our question is, when did our personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ begin? Have you thought about that? Some of us know exactly when it was, okay? Others of us feel like we've kind of morphed into it because we've known Jesus, you know, we've known about Jesus since we were little bitty kids, right? Since we were born or whatever. Grandma did a good job or mom and dad did a good job. But I truly believe that there comes a time, even if it's later in your adult life, even if you felt like you had loved God forever, when you finally say, it is my relationship with Jesus now. Not that, you know, not that understanding of my grandmother's, it's mine. So when did you knowingly respond, or have you knowingly responded to God through Jesus Christ and said, here I am, send me? Moses made that commitment. Now, that didn't mean he didn't question it. He was like, me, Lord, I stutter, you know, but at that point in time, he knew that his life was never going to be the same. As long as Moses listened to, this is our last lesson, as long as Moses listened to and followed God, the Lord was able to guide Moses. Moses never made it into the promised land because there was one time when God told him specifically what to do, and he decided to do something else. One time in 40 years. Yikes. We believe in God's grace and mercy, right? But as long as Moses listened to and followed God, the Lord was able to guide Moses. In the end, Moses was considered a faithful servant of the Lord. One of the few that got to see God, speak with God, be with God. I mean, he was tight, right, with God. Because he listened to and followed God's instructions. May we all learn from Moses' life today. There's so many treasures in the account of Moses. Thanks be to God. Amen.